Before we get to Revelation, I want to begin with a couple of examples of apocalyptic literature which appear in the Old Testament, and I have an example of another piece of apocalyptic literature which comes from a book that was considered widely authoritative, and even a passage which appears in the New Testament itself. So let me show you what we've got. In the book of Ezekiel, we see one kind of apocalyptic set of material which talks about the future of God's reign on earth in terms of a temple. Now, there had been numerous talks about there being a temple in heaven, and even back in the Torah, when God was instructing Moses how to build this portable shrine they called a tabernacle, Moses is thought to have had a vision of heaven which gave him the plans for making this tabernacle. And a lot of talk during the time that we're speaking of now, late Old Testament, there was a sense that that temple was up in heaven and that Moses was able to see a vision of it. That wave of thought was followed with a number of writings about a heavenly temple, which seemed to be part of God's plan for the rest of time and for God's judgment. So, for instance, in Ezekiel 40, God transports Ezekiel. He's a Jewish prophet. Transports Ezekiel to what looks like a new Jerusalem with a new temple. So this is one of the many ways in which apocalypses start to appear. There may have been a sense that the temple was run in a corrupt manner anyway, and that God wanted to correct that. Also, Ezekiel may have been reflecting on his community's efforts to rebuild the temple, at least his encouragement for them to do so. Another theme in apocalypses is a sense of judgment. There is a sense that even though people get away with doing terrible things to others, and even though armies can come in and annihilate communities and kingdoms, God would bring justice. And if God cannot bring justice, then people were just not willing to talk about God anymore. But how can God bring justice if the person who is the perpetrator of such an act dies? How can God bring justice after that? Well, some of these apocalyptic passages present an answer to that. We see in Zechariah 6 chariots, first red horses, then black horses, then white horses, and then dappled gray horses. Now, these horses are images of God's judgment, and the reason that there are four of them is because God sends out and executes judgments all over the world, which is represented here by the four winds or the four directions that people knew of back then. So this passage in Zechariah 6 is one which talks about apocalypses in terms of God judging the earth. Another aspect, and I think this is probably even more important for the New Testament, is the tendency in apocalypses for a revered figure in Jewish history to ascend to heaven and to meet God and see what things are like up there. And of course, the point of the trip is to see how God is going to bring an end to the world. In most of these apocalypses, that figure returns to the earth and reveals what God has revealed in that particular vision of heaven. I have this passage in Daniel 7 in which a human being came to the clouds of heaven. In other words, this person ascended to heaven, was presented to God, and God gives him authority over absolutely everything on the earth. Exactly what this means is debated, but I think it's the best guess is that that person who is ascending to heaven is a personification of Israel itself. And the vision which Daniel gets assures the people of Israel that God will will continue to let them know what's going on and that God has their best interests in mind as God continues judgment. The final passage that I want to go over with you is from the book of First Enoch, chapter 14. Now, Enoch is not in the Old or the New Testaments, but it is a book that was widely read by Jewish people in the last couple of years prior to Christ and even after that. First Enoch has a number of different kinds of materials, but in one of those chapters, in chapter 14, again, we have a vision of heaven, and we have somebody ascending from earth to heaven. He says, while winds in the vision assisted my flight, accelerating my process, the wind is blowing him up into heaven. And then he sees a throne with flaming fire issued. And notice the image that he has, one in great glory, what great glory sat upon it. Of course, this is an image of God. His robe is brighter than the sun and whiter than the snow. So I want you to keep that imagery in mind as we start to take a look at Revelation itself.